recorded. So let's take another look at the widgets company website, but this time let's do it in the shoes of our attacker. So to an attacker, there's going to be a few things that will often stand out. So primarily, they're going to be interested in anything that's likely to be CPU intensive or that will hit a database. So that would be like the search field here and the login field here. So the reason that they look for this dynamic content specifically is that it's more likely to pass through a CDN to the back-end servers, causing those back-end servers to then be overwhelmed. So an attacker in general will not focus on resources that are hosted on the CDN provider, since the CDN provider has much larger pipes, much more server capacity, and it's going to be very difficult to actually take that CDN provider offline. So another likely target is any non-CDN hosted content that's very large. So in the case of this image, that's not hosted on the CDN, and it's 107K in size. So what that means is each small HTTP request that we do for that large image, it's basically going to send back 107K response. So if you do some quick math for an attack that's 10,000 requests per second, that actually works out to 8.5 gigabits per second of traffic that the server will attempt to send to the attacker's nodes. So it basically has the effect of the attack is causing you to overwhelm your own bandwidth by trying to deliver all this content out to the world. So, aside from looking at the website, how else do attackers find targets? So one of my favorites is just using a simple port scanner. So a port scanner, for those that aren't familiar with them, it's simply a tool that allows an attacker to probe a network and get a list of what services are accessible from the internet. So there's a variety of these tools available out there for free, open source tools that you can get. And I would certainly recommend that if you aren't regularly using these as part of your own internal audit and testing procedures, that you add them into your mix, because they do give you a good visibility into the exposure that you're presenting to the internet. And then one thing I'd like to call out when it comes to these port scanners is the speed at which an attacker can scan a network. So with a single modest server, an attacker can easily scan an entire host in less than a second and an entire /16 network in about 12 hours. And there's even a tool called mass scan, which reports to be able to scan the entire internet in under 6 minutes if it has sufficient network capacity. So, the point I'd like to make there is that if you think that you'll hide from attackers just because you don't think they'll stumble across your resources on the net, it's a bit foolhardy to think that, because an attacker with sufficient resources can scan the entire network in hardly any time at all. So what did our port scanner show when we scanned the widget's network, or the widget's address, rather? My apologies. Sorry, one of my notes was out of order. So in the top window, in this command window that we have here, we can see the results of the scan, and you can see that the bad news for our attacker is that it discovered exactly what we would expect. So you can see here down in blue that only HTTP and HTTPS are accessible from the internet. And then furthermore, if you note in red here, we can also see that the website is located behind Amazon CDN. So that's what this cloudfront.net, so that's Amazon CDN. So basically, their website is protected by CloudFront. So what else can an attacker uncover? So let's sort of switch gears, and let's take a look at the widget's DNS servers to see how that's configured. So there's a lot of a lot of data here, but I'll just kind of simplify it. So in the top part of this command window, the attacker is running this DNS query to see what name servers are authoritative for the widget's domain. So they're basically looking up this domain, and you can see that the authoritative name server is this dns.widgets.nimbusddos.com with IP address 52.8.85.195. Okay, so digging a little bit deeper, our attacker now looks at the reverse DNS for that IP address. So here in the bottom half of the window, we can see the reverse DNS of that IP address, and then highlighted in green here, you can see the response, and you can see that server is an Amazon EC2 instance. So for those that are unfamiliar with Amazon, EC2 is basically, it's the name that they use for their virtual machine technology. So what this means is that the name server that runs the widget's website is a single virtual machine that's being hosted on Amazon. So taking all this information, what attack vectors does this leave our attacker with at this point? So the good news for the widgets company is that many of the attacks that they were once susceptible to are no longer possible because they're located behind a CDN. So in our last, the one from November 2015, all of the items in red would have worked. So all of these bandwidth attacks, the protocol attacks, and then some of the layer 7 attacks. Now the bad news is that there's still plenty of attack vectors available, and this is only what we discovered in 5 minutes. So I just want to quickly talk about each one of these categories. So a bandwidth DDoS attack, it's generally the first type of attack that an attacker will try, and the reason is that its effect is pretty much universal on almost all organizations, and they tend to be trivial to launch. So the reason these work is that most organizations have a finite amount of network capacity. And the realities of how networks work is that it doesn't matter how good your network equipment is if you saturate the physical circuit upstream of all that network equipment. So if you have firewalls, IDS hardware, things like that, that stuff really doesn't protect you at all if you fill the pipe going into those. And that's basically how bandwidth denial of service attacks work. Now, if a bandwidth DDoS isn't effective, then an attacker will typically switch to a protocol attack like a SYN flood. Now, a SYN flood, for those not familiar with them, it's basically a large volume of the initial packets used for creating a network connection, and it tends to network equipment such as the firewalls and the routers. So it may not fill the it might not fill the internet circuit, but it will put undue stress on the firewalls and the other network equipment in your environment. And this was the attack that was used in our last webinar that was highly effective at that time. And you can see that that's no longer a attack vector because that SYN flood would be absorbed by the CDN vendor. And sort of lastly, we know that our target is susceptible to a variety of layer 7 attacks such as HTTP and HTTPS request floods and potentially a DNS request flood. So there you have it. In 5 minutes or so, we identified 4 possible attack methods that can be used on the target. Obviously, a attacker that is more interested in causing havoc in your environment will spend a little bit more than 5 minutes. So the list that they might find of possible attacks, it could be hundreds of types of attacks that they might be able to use. So the next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to walk us through a live demo where I'm going to be performing a UDP DNS request flood against the widget's corporate name server. So in this attack, what we're going to be doing is I'm going to be sending a large number of DNS requests to the name server, and the goal is that I'm going to attempt to overwhelm that name server, and by doing that, make the website no longer available. So let me switch over to browser window. So before we launch the attack, I want to just quickly show everyone the current status of the target. So in a web browser, we can see, here's our web page. I'm sure right now there's probably a whole bunch of attendees that are loading this page and checking it out. And if we reload this page, we'll just do it a few times, you can see that it loads pretty quickly. And there's no errors or anything like that. Everything looks pretty normal. So everything looks good there. Now I'm going to switch over to some console windows that I have here. Just very quickly, actually, just so that everyone can follow what I'm doing, the top left window, that's going to be our attacker window. So this is a server that's being controlled by the attacker. The bottom left is going to be the DNS server. That's the target of our attack. The top right is just my local workstation, my laptop, that we're going to be using just to run some basic tests on. And then the bottom right is actually the web server that sits behind the CDN provider and provides the actual website. So the content that's being shown on this web page is being served by this web server. But it's being served through the CDN. So the CDN is what accesses this server, not the end user. So anyway, let's go to this top right window that has the that's my local laptop here, and just to again confirm that the website is performing normally, I'm going to use the curl command, which is a command line way of issuing a web request to download a web page. So I'm going to issue this curl command, and if we do that, you can see, there's a whole bunch of HTML data that's provided, and down at the bottom here, this is the time that it took to produce that web page. So you can see that it's 372 milliseconds. And if we run that a few different times, you can see that each time it's fairly responsive at under a second each time. And then the other thing I'd like to show is just to test out the DNS server. If we go over to our DNS server window here, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to start a packet capture over there. And actually, it looks like this must be people that are in the webinar who are loading the web page. So you can see actually that there's a lot of there's requests coming in and then answers being provided. What I was going to show was in the top right window, I'm going to do a manual DNS request against that name server, and I was going to show you in the TCP dump that request, but obviously you can see that for yourself right there. But I will still run that command, so I'm going to be using the command dig, which performs a manual request, and you can see that it does produce an answer. And if we do that a few times, you can see that it's very quick, 90 milliseconds, 91 milliseconds, 91 milliseconds. So behaving very well. So let me stop this packet capture. So at this point, everything's actually running really well. No degradation, pages are loading well, DNS server is working well. Now let's start the actual attack. So in our top window here, my attacker is going to run his attack script, which what this is going to be doing is it's going to be initiating the sending of all the bad traffic to this DNS server. And what I'm going to do, just so that we can see kind of what's going on, is I'm also going to run a packet capture down on the DNS server to see if we can capture some of that bad traffic that the attacker is sending. So I'm going to go ahead and fire that off. So that's running in the background. Now I'm going to do my packet capture. Actually, well, this is even better example of the behavior that I was talking about. So the packet capture, I actually can't run it, and my connection to that DNS server has apparently frozen because of the attack. See, so I actually just got disconnected from that server. So anyway, so you can see it's actually having some effect. Now, if we go back to our to my local laptop in the top right corner here, if we run that same DNS request against the DNS server, you can see that it doesn't produce any output. So before, it took about 90 milliseconds for us to see a response to that request, and now we don't get anything. And we can do this a few times. It's possible that a few requests may end up going through and working properly. The nature of DDoS is that the attack traffic will tend to block the majority of requests, but every now and then you still might get a small percentage of legitimate traffic that makes it through. But as you can see, we're not getting any responses whatsoever. And if I then run that same curl command that I ran before to load the web page from the command line, if I run that, again, we see the same behavior where it basically just hangs trying to load that page. And I'll just give that a moment to emphasize the point that it's not loading. And I'll just try that a few more times. So, here I canceled it after waiting 16 seconds. So, again, clearly it's not working properly. And if we now then switch over to our regular web browser over here, and we try to reload this, you'll see that it just keeps on trying to load. The status bar never really progresses. And I'm sure that there's probably a few of you guys on the, a few of you folks on the call that are probably trying to load the page right now, and you can certainly confirm that it's 100% down. And I'll just try that a few more times. And as you can see, no success. So now that we've taken the site offline, which, as you saw, didn't really take a lot of time, I'm going to shut down the attack. All right, there we go. Shut down the attack. And with the attack stopped, our tests will slowly start to resume normal operation. So first thing I'm going to do is in the bottom left window, I'm going to try and reconnect to the server that I got disconnected from. And you can see I got back in there. So that's at least somewhat promising. If I do a TCP dump, you can see that there's not, there's a small amount of traffic coming in. And if we go back over to my local workstation and we do that manual dig request again, we can see that it's returned back to normal. And it's very responsive. I can run that, and it's 88 milliseconds, 93 milliseconds, 89 milliseconds, very, very fast. And again, if we do that same curl command that we did before, it should start loading. Yep. Sometimes it takes a little while for things to return back to normal, but now you can see we're getting the HTML web page. The response times are under a second, and it's very repeatable. I can keep on running that. It seems to load very quickly, just like it did before. And as a final form of confirmation, if we go back to our web browser, we hit refresh, we can see that the page loads properly. The progress meter looks normal. Everything looks good. So, how do we go about protecting ourselves? Now, the first reaction that most network admins have is to block a DDoS attack at the network ingress points using either a firewall or an IDS or something like that. Now, the challenge with this approach is that it's a substantial administrative burden as it requires the admins to become experts in DDoS attacks. Additionally, blocking that traffic once it's already come across your internet circuits may not even help. So remember, the key to blocking the traffic is to block that traffic before it hits your internet circuits as far upstream as possible, because once a bandwidth DDoS attack has filled those circuits, it doesn't really matter whether you drop that traffic or not. So again, firewall and IDS may or may not be successful in mitigating an attack. Now, if you live in the cloud, you may be able to leverage the elasticity of the cloud to handle the DDoS traffic. This approach is actually the approach that is recommended by Amazon for dealing with a DDoS attack. So they have some white papers that talk about using Amazon's elasticity to absorb DDoS attacks. Now, the challenge with this is that most cloud scaling strategies are not instantaneous. So it may take hours to scale up to meet that traffic demand for the sudden burst of DDoS traffic. So, think for a moment, if you built your infrastructure to handle 1 gigabit worth of traffic, and then suddenly it's receiving 650 gigabits of traffic. You can imagine that the elasticity, eventually it will scale up to meet that demand, but it may take a very long time to start up all the servers and provision all the network resources and so forth. And then additionally, it may not even be possible to do elastic scaling for some applications. So for example, if you have a web app that's being driven by a monolithic database, that it may end up being a problem where you can't scale up that database beyond a single machine that's very, very large. So you end up possibly maxing out certain components of your environment that don't scale properly. And then, of course, the last downside to the auto-scale approach is that it becomes a DDoS on your wallet, because all of those resources in Amazon or your other cloud vendor, those aren't free. You obviously have to pay for those. So if an attacker is targeting you and they run an attack against you for a month, you're going to be paying for all of those resources to handle that traffic for a month, which can become very expensive. So another common approach that I see is folks will provision on-premise DDoS mitigation devices. So just like with the blocking with firewalls, this approach does require that you have in-house DDoS expertise as well as the network capacity to sufficiently handle the DDoS attack. So just as with the firewall blocking, again, it doesn't make any sense to block that traffic once it's already reached your equipment. So oftentimes you have to do that upstream, most specifically for volumetric DDoS attacks. Another way that you can protect yourself is to hide behind a content distribution network. And this is the clever solution that the Widgets company used. And you could see that it had a partial effect by hiding behind that CDN vendor. The idea there is that since a CDN vendor acts as a large proxy on a large network, you can basically use their resources to protect yourself against most bandwidth and protocol attacks. Now, there is a big caveat, as we saw, which is that it won't help you against layer 7 attacks unless the CDN specifically offers some DDoS mitigation service along with their CDN offering. And then the last two options, these are what I would consider the best approach for most organizations, and that is to use a dedicated DDoS scrubbing service to filter the traffic on their network before it even reaches you. Now, these services are usually offered in two different flavors. One is a proxy-based that anyone can use to protect their website, and then the other is a BGP-based, which can be used for those that use BGP on their networks. If you have the option, I generally recommend using the BGP solution, as it's a more complete solution and it fully protects your back-end servers. And of course, the services that are being provided by my co-presenters from Encapsula fall into these last two categories, where they provide a DDoS mitigation on top of a CDN platform. Now, all of this is a lot of information. So what I'd like to do is provide a little bit of guidance on where a business should start when it comes to being more prepared for DDoS. So here I have a little short roadmap to DDoS preparedness. The starting point from my perspective is to first understand the DDoS risks within your environment. So to do this, you basically want to review your environment with the mindset of a potential attacker. Now, this isn't unlike what we did today, but it's much more exhaustive, covering all the IT resources, including third-party vendors that are critical to the infrastructure. So rather than spending 5 minutes like we did today, this would be a more significant endeavor where all of the resources are analyzed and all the ingress points are reviewed and weaknesses are discovered. In many ways, it's not unlike a vulnerability scan. Like I'm sure a lot of you have done pen testing and vulnerability scans, and it's very similar to that, except that the focus is on DDoS, whereas pen testing and vulnerability testing, that's more about preventing people from breaking into your environment. So there's a different focus, and they're not really the same thing, but they have the same mindset, is what I like to say. So once you know the risks within your environment and that risk assessment is complete, the data that's been collected should be validated with simulated DDoS attacks. So these simulations will basically help determine the exact impact of an attack targeting each of those risk areas. And the most critical thing is that it will also take a hypothetical risk and make it more concrete by collecting performance data and other metrics. So after you've performed the risk assessment, you know that there's some areas that might be of concern, but you really don't understand how big of a risk it is. So the testing will actually confirm how big of a problem you have, and it will also basically make it real. Until then, it's really just hypothetical, and you're just throwing darts at a wall. Then, with these two setup items complete and this initial work done, you can basically then boil that data down to craft and implement a DDoS mitigation strategy. And that data that you've collected can help you make intelligent choices about which mitigation solution to use and how it might be implemented in your environment to most effectively protect the environment. And then the last thing that I generally recommend is ongoing training and periodic retesting of the environment. So I've worked in a few different environments, and not a single one of them was static. And I think I probably speak for everybody on this call when I can assume that almost every environment out there is constantly changing and it's dynamic. And it's this dynamic nature that tends to introduce new risk areas. So something as simple as a code change may introduce a new DDoS attack vector. So to stay ahead of the new risks, a business needs to be proactive with their preparedness strategy. And of course, as you might have guessed, Nimbus DDoS can certainly help out with a good portion of these assessment components. And obviously, the folks at Encapsula, when it comes to mitigation strategies and mitigation solutions, they have that covered as well. So by all means, if you want to talk about any of these items, certainly feel free to reach out to me, and I'll be happy to. And the same, I'm sure, goes for the Encapsula folks as well. So that is my time, everyone. Again, I just want to let everyone take note of my contact information. Again, feel free also to reach out to me on LinkedIn. I'll be happy to connect, and we can talk about DDoS. I love talking about DDoS, so feel free to chat me up. And also follow us on Twitter at Nimbus DDoS.